we've been seeing this a little bit more and more as we are getting closer to certainly the rapture every day. We're getting closer. We know that's a fact. You and Lee Brainerd were talking about this on your podcast recently, and we see this idea of a gap. So the rapture happens, and then how long until the start of the tribulation period? So why don't we start there? What is required for what signs? I'll say this carefully. What signs must precede the rapture? Okay, if any, and then what starts the 70th week of Daniel or the tribulation period?
Well, we'll start with the second question first. So the start of the 70th week of Daniel is very clearly described for us in Daniel 9:27. It's when the Antichrist confirms a covenant. And so that's the hard start to it. That starts the clock ticking on that final 7-year period. That Shabuah is the Hebrew word that Daniel talks about, a week or a period of 7 years. One Shabuah is a 7-year period in that context. So that one's an easy one to answer. The first question, which was how long is the gap, or I forgot.
No, I said what events must precede the rapture.
Yeah. So my view is based on a variety of theological conclusions on the doctrine of imminency. Nothing must precede the rapture. The rapture hypothetically could have happened at any time in the last 2,000 years. That's why you see, for example, 7 times in the New Testament, all of them by the Apostle Paul, except in Hebrews, which if Paul wrote Hebrews, then all of them by Paul, the word apekdekamai, eagerly waiting. Well, you don't eagerly wait for something that you know is going to happen at a prescribed time. Yeah, you might be getting ready for it, but if you know it's not going to happen until next Tuesday, you're not going to be eagerly waiting for it on, Friday, right? Several days ahead.
Or even today, yeah.
Or even, yeah. So, apekdekamai means to eagerly wait for it. We are eagerly waiting for the return of the Lord. We also know that the church is not going to be part of the wrath of God, which I believe is the 7-year tribulation. I think that's the formal prophetic wrath of God. You see that they're already hiding from the wrath in Revelation 6 as the tribulation gets started. I know different people in the Bible prophecy world take different view on that, but that's my view. And so Paul tells us we will be rescued before the great and terrible day of the Lord's wrath. So knowing that, we know the rapture must happen. And then after the rapture, that's when the end times really kicks into gear. So I don't see any prophecy. If you make a list of unfulfilled prophecies, which we actually have a list of the sequential order of end times prophecies as an appendix in our book, What Lies Ahead. But if you take that list, I don't think anything is going to come before the rapture. In other words, rapture is number 1. You don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and get down to number 6, and it's the rapture. I don't think because if that were the case, then we would be watching for these things first before the rapture. So I don't think any prophecy must be fulfilled before the rapture. The rapture is the next event on God's prophetic calendar, in my estimation.
So going for the sake of people out there, so that's why I asked it the way I did is, okay, the rapture is not very specifically tied to any pre-events of any kind. Now, could something happen prior to the rapture? Let's say Ezekiel 38, hypothetically, any other, some of these outliers, whatever they might. But Ezekiel 38 is probably the easiest one because I think all of us see that as being unfulfilled historically. So is it possible, even hypothetically, that could happen prior to the rapture?
Yeah, so again, going back to one of my books, it's called What Lies Ahead. It's a biblical overview of the end times. It's basically an eschatology textbook. I have a whole chapter on Gog and Magog, and I mentioned, I think, 8 views among dispensationalists about the timing of that. So that right there should tell you this is an area that we want to hold with a degree of humility, like we should all use, and different scholars have placed it in different places. So what I've come to realize is that we like to think in terms of hard, fast, precise moments on a timeline. And I don't think it's going to be as clear as what we think in real time. In other words, someday when we're all in the eternal state in the new heavens and the new earth, looking back over human history, then we'll be able to pinpoint, oh, that's the date of that, that's the date of that. It's kind of like today the history books talk about the start of World War I with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Well, when that happened in real time, what was it, 1914, I think, it's not like the minute the gun went off, or I don't even remember how he was assassinated, but it's not like the moment he died, all of a sudden bells and whistles went off announcing the start of World War I. We just, things happen in real time, and then as we kind of do, hindsight, we begin to say, yeah, that pretty much triggered
Start the
it.
chain of events.
So yes, could it, if you change the word to could it happen, I think we could be seeing the rumblings and beginnings of what maybe someday will be called the start of this northern invasion of Israel today. And that doesn't violate imminency. It's not saying that a prophecy is being fulfilled at that moment. It's just saying that the stage is being set. And that's the terminology that I've used most of my years in terms of describing end times prophecy, is the stage is being set. If you're more comfortable saying that's sort of the beginnings of Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog and Magog, I don't have a problem with that theologically.
Would we talked earlier about? I know Fruchtenbaum in his writings he spoke about the possibility, based on the burning of the weapons for 7 years, that he felt that, again, not dogmatic, that the Gog-Magog war would occur 3.5 years prior to the start of the tribulation period, because then you'd have that 3.5 years of burning prior to the start of the 7th week, and then the first half of the 7th week would be the final 3.5 year period of the burning of the weapons, because at the midpoint, according to his perspective, Israel wouldn't be able to burn the weapons because they'd be so discombobulated by fleeing to the mountains, etc. So, in that sense, I don't remember whether he discussed the rapture. Again, the rapture can't be tied to anything. We know that. So, is that scenario at least possible or feasible? Again, I'm not saying how probable it is because we don't know, but could we, again, going back, could that happen, and then the rapture happens after that?
Yeah, again, I think the beginnings of it could happen. We may not identify it as that. It may be happening behind the scenes. It's kind of like people say, well, since we know the tribulation is precisely 7 years, even to the day in some places.
20, yeah.
So, how come people won't know when the second coming's happening, and they might be caught off guard, as Jesus describes in passages like the 10 virgins and so forth. Well, the fact is, you won't know when that quill hits the sheepskin or the pen hits the paper or whatever, however they're signing the treaty at that moment. That'll probably happen in some back office, and then they'll make an announcement. You won't know the minute, the second, the hour that actually took place. So it's kind of hard to say for sure. But yeah, I think it's possible. I love Arnie Fruchtenbaum. He's brilliant. He's a friend. I don't necessarily see the gap of time being many, many years the way he outlines it, but his view is certainly plausible, and it doesn't violate any scriptures. It fits the biblical data, but that's what we're all trying to do, is take the biblical data and come up with schemes and scenarios that work. Andy Woods, another dear friend of both of ours, he puts the entire Gog and Magog in the tribulation in a very unusual view, really. In fact, he's the only one I know that kind of fleshes it out quite that way. Some people put it in the first half. Some people put it in the second half. He kind of puts it starting in the first half and bleeding over into the second half. So, I respect those views, and who knows, but for my part, I don't see Gog and Magog having anything to do within the 70th week of Daniel. And here's my reasoning. Maybe it's too simplistic, but basically, of course, people know Gog and Magog involves a northern alliance coming against Israel to try to attack God's nation. In the first half of the tribulation, Israel is protected by treaty from the world leader, the Antichrist, and no one would dare to come against them because they're protected. And the Bible tells us they're protected for 3.5 years. In the second half of the tribulation, that treaty is broken, and we know that according to Ezekiel 38 and 39, that northern alliance that does come against them, and it's very vivid, the description you get there, is defeated. Well, in the second half, Israel's, is Israel's defeated, not the alliance. Israel's fleeing, as you said, to the mountains on the run. So I just don't see it fitting in either part. That's why, I tended to put it between the rapture and the start of the tribulation. But what's interesting, and you and I were talking about this before we started, that gap of time between the rapture and the second coming over the years, if you read the writings,
The start of the tribulation.
Yeah. So the gap between the rapture and the beginning of Daniel's 70th week, that gap's gotten bigger
It's gotten
and
bigger.
bigger and bigger. It just keeps growing
That's how I feel.
as current events happen, and people keep shoving all kinds of stuff in there, and they may be right.
Yeah, they may be right, but they may not be right.
But
either, right?
but where I've adjusted my thinking somewhat is realizing as things are changing so rapidly, with the one world system, the central bank digital currencies, systems that could be employed to roll out the mark of the beast, I could very easily see some of these rumblings happening before the rapture. Doesn't mean it's the fulfillment of a prophecy.
It's the setting of the stage.
It's the setting of the stage.
Because, I think too that, all of us at least for me, for 30 years and others, in the sense of talking about a cashless society. That goes way back. Even before I was a Christian. And we base it off of Revelation 13:17 about buying and selling and everything else. Well, the idea of a cashless system, that began, long time ago in certain things, especially in China and other places. So just because you have in China, it's already cashless, doesn't mean it's a fulfillment of the mark of the beast, but it is, again, I like to say this, we don't go from Mayberry one day before the signing of the covenant to the next day to lawlessness abounds and everything else. We've seen this long progress of all of the conditions of the culture, the conditions of the church, the apostasy, the departing of the faith, however you want to say it, however Scripture says it, going all the way down. This has been a long time in the works, as you write so brilliantly about all the works of the enemy in building up all these societies and everything else. So there is a stage setting, and that doesn't mean that, again, it's fulfilled. But let me ask you this, just so people can understand. The gap is getting bigger for different reasons, but the rapture is not tied to the signing of the covenant, right, at all.
Right.
See, that's the key. Oftentimes, and it's like people would make this assumption, the rapture, and then it's like, wait a minute. Now, that could be the case. We were saying earlier, it could be 1 second before, whatever. But it's not absolutely tied there.
No. Yeah, the church and Israel are distinct. And so you see a lot of people today. I was talking to Gary before we went on about how there just seems to be an upsurge in everybody talking about the soon coming of the Lord. And I don't know if we're all just listening to our own echoes or if really there's so much going on in the world that everybody's starting to notice, I think we're getting close. But because of that, you see a lot of people talking about how the rapture is going to happen at this certain time of year, and they try to connect it to the Jewish feasts. Well, what they need to recognize is that the church is not in any way connected to the Jewish system and the feasts and festivals. That the church started on Pentecost was coincidental in a manner of speaking. It didn't start on Pentecost because it was Pentecost. The church and Israel are two completely separate programs, and the Bible is very clear that the church is a mystery, mm-hmm. Something previously undisclosed. And so, you just see people trying to connect the church and Israel and make the church's calendar fit relating to Israel. The same thing's true at the end of the church age. It's not going to connect to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, because that was for my people and my holy city, not for the church. I think another question that's relevant here, if we really want to drill down, is when is a prophecy fulfilled? Is it fulfilled when it starts, or is it fulfilled when it's over? So mm-hmm. Take the 70 weeks of Daniel. Would we say that's fulfilled today? No, we would say it's partially fulfilled. The first 69 weeks have been fulfilled in history, but the 70th week has not been fulfilled yet. So you've got prophecies that can be one prophecy, one fulfillment done, like the virgin birth, Isaiah 7:14. You've got prophecies that can be fulfilled in stages, one prophecy fulfilled over time.
Like the beasts of Daniel, right? The revived.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, the whole world history, Daniel 2, Daniel 7.
Still going on until Jesus comes back.
Yeah, the times of the Gentiles and so forth. So could the Battle of Gog and Magog commence as a stage-setting event prior to the rapture and then not be fulfilled until after the rapture? I think it's possible.
And I think no matter what, it's hard not to see some of the 100% of the stage setting. When you look up and you see, Putin, Erdogan, and Abraham from Iran there, and going back to even Ahmadinejad, you're seeing these three stand there, and these are like the trifecta out of Ezekiel 38. You're like, so what we're seeing is we're seeing them create these military agreements, these political agreements, and other things. And it's like, well, clearly that is so different than what you had in the 90s when Turkey was extremely Western. I mean, it's a NATO country. It was looking to get into the European Union. You're like, wow, what a difference. So I totally agree with that. It's a good to get down in on that. So the question then is, so going back here, the rapture happens. What are the options between when the rapture happens and the starting or the signing of the covenant, beginning the 70th week of Daniel? 1 second to 5 years, 10 years? Can it be 100 years? And why do people see, maybe that's a good one, why do people see a gap there at all between the rapture and the start of the tribulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, as you and I have talked about in other contexts and talked about, off air today, we can't cite chapter and verse, thus saith the Lord, the gap shall be, 1 year. We just can't do that. So it's a logical conclusion. You've got two separate events clearly defined in Scripture. One of them is the rapture. The other is Daniel 9:27 and the signing of this covenant with Israel and the Antichrist. Because they're two different events, they logically must have some length of time between them, as you said, whether that's 1 second or 1 year or 7 years, like Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks. So it's sort of a logical inference. And so then, because you've got a gap, you begin to piece together and think about all the other end times events, and you begin to wonder, well, maybe this happens within that gap. But we often see gaps of time in God's prophetic plan of the ages. Even Daniel 9:24 to 27, the famous 70 weeks prophecy, that text alone, just those 4 verses, demands a gap of time.
It's clear.
Because you end the 69th week with the coming of Christ at the first advent, which, according to Harold Hoehner, corresponds to the triumphal entry, the exact day of the triumphal entry of Christ in the first century. That's it. That's the end of the 69th week. And then Daniel says some other things are going to happen after that.
The Messiah would be cut off.
Yep. And the temple would be destroyed.
Temple would be destroyed.
Yeah.
So you have 38 years there difference right there in that gap.
Yeah.
So this is why we're not making this up.
No.
There's a gap there between that, the ending of the 69th and the start of the 70th, at least 38 years.
Yeah. And not only that, if we want to drill down even closer, there was a gap of time between the end of the 69th week and the start of the church age of at least 50, I think we figured out 54 days.
54 days.
Say 50 days, because the church didn't begin until 10 days after the ascension in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. So you've got this gap of time. So to me, it seems logical, and I think it's pretty clearly laid out in Scripture that you'll have the rapture, then you'll have which ends the church age, and then you'll have some unspecified length of time before the 70th week of Daniel picks up again and commences, just like you had that gap of time after the 69th week before the church age started. So the church age is this mystery that God reveals in the New Testament. It fits perfectly with Daniel's timeline. Although Daniel doesn't mention the church, it certainly fits. You can fit it there pretty easily. And I think once the church is done, then it's like the church exits, the spotlight shifts to Israel, and we see, I believe, my best guess would be very quickly, the signing of this treaty that starts the clock ticking.
I want to tell people that you're hearing it here first, in that some of the things that we were talking about prior, and just so I want to summarize so that you understand where we're going, because we deal a lot with others, pre-wrath and other, post-trib, mid-trib, and so they're often critical of the dispensational pre-trib view. And one of the things that I've heard is that, if the 70th week or the 69th week ends, and you guys are so hard and fast on this distinction between Israel and the church, then you have this limbo period. And so what we realized as we were looking at it this morning is, as JB just mentioned, from the time of the 69th week ending, which is the arrival of Jesus in the triumphal entry, add 7 days there until his resurrection. Okay, roughly, that week, his Passion Week. So you have 7 days there, and then we know that Pentecost is 50 days after that. It also happens on a Sunday. So you have upwards of 57 days in this quote limbo period before the church began. So we thought, well, that's interesting that if the rapture ends the church age, that could there then be 57 days on the backside of it before God then turns his attention specifically towards the start of the 70th week. So if you have it over here, this would be a great chart. On the left side, you got the ending of the 69th week. You add 57 days, church begins, the church ends on the right side, and then you have 57 days and then the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. So to me, that's pretty fascinating, really, I would say, discovery, or at least a recognition of what we see historically. So going back, the idea of this gap, what else could happen, or what else would fit into this gap period? Maybe the start of Ezekiel, I don't know. I mean, what else could be in this gap period of 57 days?
Well, so what we do is we start with what is life like during the tribulation? What world events are going to take place during that 7-year period that haven't happened yet? And if the rapture were to happen today, well, then all of those types of things to prepare the way for that have to happen in the gap. So, for example, the building of the temple, right? Mm-hmm. There has to be a temple in place at least by the midpoint.
At least by the midpoint. We don't know.
To desecrate it. So conceivably, I suppose they could start and complete it
in the first half,
maybe. Yep. But if it hasn't already been built, and by the way, it could be built before the rapture. We're not saying
they already have the cornerstone, they have everything else.
Yeah,
and they actually said they could have it up in a few months, but at first they could put the tabernacle up.
To start with. So you got the place for the heaven.
That could go up in a day.
Yeah. So this is we're speaking your language. This is your area of expertise. Mm-hmm. So, but certainly, there's got to be a temple. You've got to have a one world system. You've got to have a global digital ID, some kind of a hacking and tracking ability globally. So all of those things we know will be a reality during the tribulation. Many of them could be a reality before the rapture. Nothing says it won't be.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too. Yep.
But certainly if the rapture were to happen today, that gap of time, whether it's 50 days or 5 years, and my gut tells me it's going to be rapid. A
little shorter on the shorter end.
Yeah. Here's my speculation, and I explain this in my books. I think after the rapture, in the chaos that ensues, this Northern Alliance that Ezekiel talks about is going to take advantage of the situation to try to attack Israel and take over that land for various reasons, religious and economic and otherwise. I think a Western Alliance that Daniel talks about forms that is going to come in and supersede and come against that Northern Alliance. It's my speculation that the future Antichrist is the leader of that Western Alliance. We know from Ezekiel that God is the one who actually defends Israel from the Northern Alliance, but I speculate that the Western Alliance is going to take credit for it, and this future Antichrist is going to say, look, I just solved this conflict and
maybe even supernaturally claim supernatural abilities, because we know that Revelation 13.
Yeah, it is going to be a supernatural defense. Maybe he actually takes credit for doing that, which is right out of the Antichrist playbook. Yep. So, but for whatever reason, I believe those series of geopolitical wars catapult this man to world fame. Coming out of that, he signs this treaty. So all of that could easily happen in a matter of weeks after the rapture.
60 days.
And then so that's what happens. I guess my calculations would be 54, but I'm not going to die on that hill.
Under 60.
But once he signs that treaty, then that marks him as we now know he's the Antichrist. Now the world won't know it, or Israel especially won't know it until he breaks the covenant. They're going to be deceived. But certainly from a Bible prophecy perspective, we now know that's the Antichrist, and we've got 7 years until the triumphant return of Christ. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of things that are signs or stage-setting events that, like obviously Israel, right? 1948. I mean, there's got to be an Israel on the map for all of these end times prophecies to come to pass. There wasn't for 1,800 years. All of a sudden, 1948, there is. Now, some Bible scholars who I love and respect, and we are good friends, and I've had on my program, they would say, well, May 14th, 1948 was the fulfillment of the dry bones prophecy in Ezekiel 37, or it was the fulfillment of a first return in Isaiah 11. I don't interpret those passages that way, but it's almost inconsequential in a way in the grand scheme of things because
they're here. Yeah.
they're here.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I guess to summarize this particular question is there are many people that debate this idea of a gap. Again, 1 second to 5 years or 10 years, who knows? Nobody knows. Everybody's going to approach it differently with where their strengths are and how they see things needing to be fulfilled in that particular gap period. Again, my view too is that it's shorter than longer. So at the end of the day, we stay humble about it.